Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video. For this video we're going to be discussing Plato's Republic, books 1 and 2. I'm really excited to be able to do this material. The Republic is kind of, I would say, actually Plato's most well-known dialogue. It's, extremely widely studied. It's considered sort of the most expansive articulation of Plato's philosophy. And speaking personally, one of my biggest regrets about the structure of the class that we have, right, is that we didn't have time to do all of it, right? It's really all so wonderful and amazing, and I think really foundational to a philosophical education. So if you're a major and you find this stuff really interesting, I would highly recommend that you go out and complete the Republic, because it will really be worth all of the time that you invest into that work. I mean, it's truly amazing, as I hope that we'll see to some extent today. Now, the Republic, I think, is maybe the paradigm for Plato's middle period, right? Here we really get a strong emphasis on the theory of forms. We really develop, an engagement with the real core of Plato's philosophy, which concerns issues about the soul and concerns issues about the forms. And the Republic is notable because it constantly puts this more Platonic Socrates in dialogue with the views of the Sophists, right? So in the first book of the Republic, we're going to see, there's a lot of sort of normal place setting sort of things and Platonic dialogues that we have in the beginning. However, things pretty quickly devolve into a kind of argument between Thrasymachus, a sophist, and Socrates, obviously, our paradigm of a philosopher, right? And what the debate really centers on is the nature of justice and what is the source of value for justice, right? And to get ahead of ourselves a little bit and just say the main thesis of what Thrasymachus seeks to prove, Thrasymachus seeks to prove that the reputation of justice is valuable. However, justice itself is something, like when we follow the laws, for example, that's something we do begrudgingly, right? And if we were able to, be unjust but have the reputation for justice, to kind of cheat the system in a way, that would be the best thing that we could do, right? And that's what Thrasymachus thinks that all intelligent rulers do, is they use deception. They, will use any means necessary to acquire their own advantage and political power. Socrates, of course, does not accept this thesis, right? Socrates maintains that justice is intrinsically valuable. He actually says it's both intrinsically and extrinsically valuable. So it's valuable for its own sake, but it's also valuable for what it can bring about, right? So it's valuable to be just, and it's also valuable to have the reputation for justice. And, if you were to read book 1 of the Republic alone, it seems a lot like a Socratic dialogue, right? Plato encounters someone who thinks that they have an idea of justice. He interrogates them, right? And he finds their views wanting, right? And, book 1 kind of ends with Thrasymachus being pissed off and not really interested in talking anymore, right? And we've seen now that that's sort of like the standard ending for a Socratic dialogue, right? But the Republic, unlike these Socratic dialogues, keeps going, right? Why does it keep going? Well, because there's, two people of a genuinely philosophical nature, namely Glaucon and Adeimantus, who want to try to continue the debate that was opened by Thrasymachus, to argue on behalf of Thrasymachus's views, right? But not because they genuinely believe them to be true, but because they want Socrates to provide the best and strongest possible defense for the value of justice, right? And so it's really interesting because it's like, the true engagement between what you might call like the philosophy of the sophist versus the philosophy of the philosopher, right? It can't take place with them, right? Instead, we have to have some philosophical natures, Glaucon and Adeimantus, come and take on like the mantle of the sophists, right? And so that's really what allows the Republic to, in a way, keep going beyond the initial dissatisfaction that we had in the beginning book, and get into, as we'll see, especially next week, a really robust and interesting conception of justice, right? And the Republic is fascinating. One of the reasons why the Republic is fascinating, and this is a brief methodological note that we should, keep in mind throughout, and something that you'll read in Book 2 of the Republic, is that Plato has this view that the polis and the soul, right? So the political body of the city and the structure of the soul itself, right? That they are essentially the same, right? So in the same way that a city is divided into different kinds of classes, right? So too the soul has different kinds of natures, right? You have like an emotional nature, he says a spirited nature, and you have a contemplative philosophical nature, right? And these roughly correspond to social classes. So, Plato's idea is, okay, well, let's investigate our subject, namely the value of justice, but let's do it on both an individual and, political level at the same time, right? And so Plato is going to spend a lot of time in the Republic articulating what the ideal republic looks like, right? But that republic is in a way merely a reflection of the soul of a philosopher, right? And so he's always kind of talking on two registers at the same time, right? He'll say, for example, okay, well, you need to, in some books of the Republic that we don't have the time to read together, unfortunately, but I encourage you to look at, Plato says things like, well, we have to banish poets and artists from the Republic, right? They teach stories that actually harm the soul, so they have to be banished, right? And you can see that what Plato is also saying is that, well, in the life of the philosopher, right, the poet has to be banished in some respect, right? You have to banish, the tendency towards telling stories, towards what he calls mere fables, not only at an institutional, social, and political level, but also at the individual level as well, right? So many aspects of the Republic are centered around what it means to have a virtuous and philosophical soul, and thereby what the proper political and social manifestation of a philosophical nature would look like, right? And so it has this vast political ambition. And we're going to see more of that in the next couple of videos, where we're going to discuss Plato's seventh letter, right? But, think about the dialogues that we've read up to this point, right? What we saw in them, in a way, or at least one thing we might have seen in them, is that the political constitution of Athens was, in a way, more amenable to the sophist than to the philosopher, right? The philosopher dies. Socrates dies. He's executed. And the sophists effectively manipulate the legal system to make that happen, right? And one thing that, Plato Socrates says, a moment that I truly love, in the book 6 or 7, I think, is he says something like, none of our present constitutions equal a philosophical nature, right? And so we have social and political systems that are, in a certain way, a reflection of sophism and that breed sophism and make true philosophy difficult or impossible. And so there's this social and political upshot to what is often interpreted as kind of like a idiosyncratic Plato thing. Like Plato had to worry about the sophists. We don't have to now because there aren't sophists, right? Plato would say no, right? Of course, the institutions look different. You don't have someone like a sophist per se, but you have like influencers, you have celebrities, you have social media personalities, right? And these are people that are interested to manipulate mere appearances, or at least that's one reading, right, of our contemporary situation. And so, because of that, we might think that the story of the Republic is really quite crucial for us as philosophers now, right? Because, in the same way that Plato lived in a distinctly and decisively unphilosophical era, so too we face the challenges together in this classroom and outside of it of also trying to cultivate a philosophical soul or an approach towards philosophy in a political environment that is opposed to this kind of development, that wants to in a way corrupt your soul, right? And that's what Plato's Republic is all about. And that's why I think it will continue to be relevant to us today, because the political situation that it's really addressing and attempting to alleviate in some way has not gone away, right? And so what's important to the Republic, as we have in this left column here, is a series of oppositions, right? Oppositions between a philosophical way of approaching social and political problems, the nature of truth and reality, and so on, versus that of the sophist, right? The person who is interested only in the manipulation of appearances, right? And so we have philosophy versus sophism here. This is manifested in Socrates versus Thrasymachus, right? And one thing that you might note about Socrates and Thrasymachus as characters, right, is that Socrates is interested in the truth, whereas Thrasymachus is constantly like embarrassed. Plato describes him as getting red and so on. He gets mad. He, calls Socrates a baby at one point. He says to get his wet nurse and so on, right? And so Thrasymachus is really concerned with appearances, right? And correspondingly, Socrates lives his life according to a strict sense of justice. He maintains that justice is intrinsically and extrinsically valuable. It doesn't matter if anyone witnesses you being just, right? You should be just because it's good for your soul, right? Whereas Thrasymachus is interested in how having the reputation for justice brings about a certain kind of political power, right? If you, listen to Thrasymachus, or, if you were to listen in another Socratic dialogue to Gorgias, for example, they'll claim that sophism is the highest kind of wisdom, mainly because it's the kind of wisdom that can trump everything else, right? And the idea that they have is like, well, it doesn't matter how good of a philosopher you are, Socrates, if nobody is willing to listen to you, right? And so that's their idea that what really wise, competent leaders value justice for is merely the power that it gives you over other people. And it's important too, then, that we can see corresponding to these values of truth and justice and wisdom and so on. The philosopher is interested in the light, it's interested in showing things how they really are. Whereas what the sophist is interested in is the manipulation of appearances, the manipulation of mere shadows, right? This is going to be important for next week in particular, because we're going to examine Plato's allegory of the cave, which very much works on this light versus shadow imagery, right? And then the main subject that Thrasymachus and Plato discuss, or Thrasymachus and Socrates, is whether justice and being a good ruler means that you're benefiting the ruled, right? You're benefiting your citizens, right? You're trying to create a just order for everyone. Or if rulers are really interested in benefiting themselves, right? Example, one thing that Thrasymachus says is that, Socrates has this naive view as if a shepherd raises sheep for the sake of the sheep, right? No, it's for the shepherd. Similarly, Thrasymachus thinks people come into political power, they're interested in political power because of what it can get them, right? Not for the sake of helping other people or justice or whatever. He thinks that all that stuff is like really, really ultimately confused, right? And so there are arguments that are worth talking about, but basically Thrasymachus leaves in a huff, right? Like right after, he doesn't actually leave, but he's no longer interested in engaging in the conversation after book one, right? And so one way of thinking about their opposition is that Socrates maintains that justice is intrinsically and extrinsically valuable, while Thrasymachus maintains that the reputation for justice is intrinsically and extrinsically valuable. But justice itself is only extrinsically valuable. So we regrettably, follow social conventions and stuff like that. But if we could get away with it, we wouldn't, right? That's Thrasymachus's thought. And this is where Adeimantus and Glaucon kind of come in and take over Thrasymachus's position, right? And so you might get tripped up by this distinction, like intrinsically versus extrinsically valuable. So to be extrinsically valuable is to be good for the sake of something else, right? And the example that they use is money, right? Money, if you couldn't buy things with money, it's just paper, right? Or it's just like a number in your bank account, right? So if you couldn't use it as a means for purchasing goods and so on, then the money itself would have no value, right? And that's what it means to be extrinsically valuable. So similarly, like money, Thrasymachus thinks that justice is valuable because it leads to the reputation for justice, right? That's it, right? There's also things that are intrinsically valuable that don't have any extrinsic benefit, right? And the chief example for this is joy, right? When I feel a joy, I feel happy, and that joy is valuable. Like I'd rather feel joy than not feel joy, but it doesn't lead to anything further, right? I just feel happy in that moment. That's it, right? And then finally, there's this category of the intrinsically and extrinsically valuable. And this is where Socrates puts justice, right? But since that's what we're debating about, it's probably more helpful to use another example. And so, the other example that you can point to is sight, right? When I see things, right, it's like it's intrinsically valuable to be able to see things and know what's going on in your environment. And then it's also extrinsically valuable because it prevents you from like falling, right? It prevents you from running into negative, bad situations, right? It might come about because you can't see, right? And then finally, the thing that I want to end on that I'm really interested in hearing your opinion about is that Glaucon and Adeimantus want to try to push Thrasymachus' argument as far as possible. And they say that you should compare the situation of getting what is called the Ring of Gyges to being stretched on the rack, right? So the Ring of Gyges, this is actually the myth where like the Lord of the Rings comes from, right? Um, it's the idea of a ring, and you put on the ring, right, and then nobody can see you, right? And so the idea is that you could have the reputation for justice while engaging in complete injustice, right? They describe like robbing people, raping them, like these are all unjust acts that you could like get away with, right? If you had the ring. And they're like, okay, in this situation seems like ideal, right? They say everyone would want to be in this situation and no one would turn it down. To the contrary, they imagine a case where you have the reputation for injustice, but you act completely just, right? So you're just like an innocent victim that's accused of injustice, right? And in this case, they would torture you. They would stretch you out on the rack, right? So you have all your limbs, and your limbs are being pulled beyond what they can do, right? And so you're getting tortured, essentially. And Glaucon and Adeimantus are like, wouldn't we rather be in the situation where we had the Ring of Gyges instead of the situation where we're stretched on the rack, right? And you can see this as really Plato revisiting an idea that he already, had talked about to some degree in the Apology and in the Phaedo, right? Namely, that it's better to be a victim than a perpetrator of injustice, right? And so this is exactly the situation that they're using to test it, right? The Ring of Gyges, you get to be the perfect perpetrator of injustice, right? And when you're stretched on the rack, you're the perfect victim of injustice, right? And what they're trying to make the claim is that, Thrasymachus has a point. We'd rather have the Ring of Gyges than be stretched on the rack. Of course, the conversation does not end there, right? Plato wants to show that we would prefer justice, that even in this situation, we would rather be stretched on the rack than commit injustices with the Ring of Gyges. But I'm very interested in hearing your all opinion and what you have to say. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you have a great week. Bye-bye.